And in general, what I think has begun to happen in education as well is that whereas we were encouraged to learn enough facts to understand what we were looking at, but then to use our own judgment and think for ourselves, now they're taught not to do that. They are taught only to reflect the party line. And I'd like to give a little vignette which illustrates this. At Union College, Schenectady, a couple of weeks ago, I went and gave a talk on the climate, and the environmentalists, who these days are the modern equivalent of the Marxists, they don't call themselves Marxists now, that's a discredited name, but in effect they think the same way. They turned out in force to oppose my presence on campus. They set up a table with slogans written on messy pieces of recycled cardboard and people with messy hair telling people not to go in. So I went to talk to them, and in no time they were all having such a row with me that everybody filed into the lecture hall and about 200 people turned up before they could stop them. But then they had a counter meeting afterwards, whose job was to try to refute all the errors that Monckton had perpetrated in his science. But of course, by now I've been doing this long enough that I'm making what is certainly a stateable case. You might not agree with it, but there isn't too much that is actually wrong with it. So they were finding it fairly hard to do this. They were just reasserting the usual stuff that you hear from that side of the case. But I went and sat in the front row, since they'd come and listened to my lecture and had asked questions. I thought, well, I'll go and do them the favour of returning the compliment and hear what the other side has to say. And at one point in my talk, I had shown a slide of the graph that leads to the principal conclusion in the IPCC's 2007 report. This graph purports to show that in the last 160 years, the rate of global warming has not just carried on in a straight line, it's been accelerating. And that this acceleration is our fault. And they say this at least twice in the IPCC's 2007 report. And the way they get this result is by choosing very carefully the start points of 4 different trend lines that all end in the present. And they show that the most recently starting trend lines are steeper than the ones that came before. And therefore, they say, this illustrates that the warming rate is accelerating. Well, now, this is a well-known and very bogus statistical technique. I say it's well-known among statisticians. But if you're a policymaker reading this and you haven't got any background in mathematics, that's the kind of trick that will fool you. It's actually fraudulent. There is no basis for any such conclusion. But that's what they did. So I demonstrated in my talk, really quite compellingly, that this was a trick by applying exactly the same technique to a sine wave whose trend by definition is 0, and showing that I could, depending on which segment of the sine wave I took, I could then choose my trend lines very carefully and show that the sine wave in fact was exhibiting an accelerating downtrend, or if I shifted the whole thing half a cycle, then I could show that the sine wave was exhibiting a rapidly accelerating uptrend. And that shows the technique is bogus, because I'm using the same technique on the same data where we know what the trend is. And we get opposite results, both of which conflict with the real trend. So I've shown them all this. And it's really not difficult. You do not need to be Einstein to understand, once you've seen that demonstration, that that graph in the IPCC's 2007 report is bogus. So towards the end of their meeting, somehow the topic of this graph came up. I can't remember quite how. And I said, well, that is an example of something which the IPCC got wrong. And it's simply not sensible for that. There were 4 professors and several PhDs, they're all saying the IPCC is perfect and wonderful. I said, if you do not deal with the fact that over and over again they bend the evidence and data in this way, then you're not going to appear credible. As the science gradually collapses, people are going to go back and say, well, why were all the professors teaching this wall to wall without the caveats, without showing where the IPCC is getting things wrong? And so the professor then snapped and said, right, I want everyone in this class to put their hand up if they agree with me that the IPCC got that graph right. And 2/3 of the hands in that class went up, even though they had seen that this graph was wrong, and they knew that the graph was wrong. So I said, right, hands up, all those of you who've just put your hand up, who are statisticians. One hand began to go up, stopped halfway, and came back down again, because the guy suddenly realised that if he admitted he was a statistician, he had no excuse for having put his hand up to agree with a graph that he knew he was wrong. And you could see this thought process going in his mind, and he brought his hand back down again. And then one of the students said, but then are you a statistician? I said, well, first of all, frankly, you don't need to be once you've seen the demonstration I've just given you. However, I said, I have learnt to be careful. And I anonymised the data that underlay this graph, and I sent it to a statistician. And I said, I want you to look at this anonymised data and tell me whether I can draw the following conclusions by taking the trend lines on the following periods. And the answer, of course, came back, no, of course you can't, because you can choose trend lines on different periods and get the same data to give you a precisely opposite result. So I then said to that class, I said, first of all, Professor, you shouldn't have done that. And to the rest of the class, I said, don't you ever do that again. Don't you ever vote against what you know not to be true. Don't you ever vote that it is true when you know it isn't. Not even to appease authority. Because that's not what science is about. Science is about trying to reach the objective truth. And there must be no more nonsense of this kind ever again. You could have heard a pin drop. But you see, what has happened is that the notion of thinking for yourself has gone from education. And now all they're taught is the party line. And there is genuine shock, horror, disbelief, and anger when somebody comes along and says, maybe the party line isn't right. Because they're simply not familiar with the fact that there could be an alternative point of view. And that shows, it seems to me, a very basic failure of education.
It's harder to get that point of view out, though, isn't it? There's seems to be an attack on freedom of speech in the West compared to what there was in the past. Mostly, I would say, by a liberal multiculturalist policy to appease those cultures which don't even agree with Western liberal democracies.
Do
you find that that's the case?
I think the first thing is don't call it liberal. Whatever else it is, not liberal. It's
not classical liberal.
It's illiberal.
Yes.
In the plain and full meaning of the term,
yes.
It's illiberal.
You're absolutely right, but here in Canada, I think that the capital L liberals are very much the market.
Even so, don't let them use such words without pointing out, even if it's the name of their party, without pointing out that it's the antithesis of what they actually mean by it.
I agree totally.
They are illiberal.
Yes.
These are people who do not want any thought but the party line to prevail. If you read 1984, there's that wonderful passage where the communist orator is spouting the party line, and note is handed up to him telling him the party line has changed 180 degrees. In mid-sentence, he begins arguing 180 degrees against what he was arguing a moment before, and nobody comments because it's more than their life is worth. Once you're told the party line, if you are a Marxist or an environmentalist, which is a new word for it, then you merely adopt the party line and you stop thinking. And stopping thinking is the antithesis of a proper education. Education is there to teach you how to think. And in fact, I'm about to write a book called just that, How to Think. And it's going to explain once again the classical methods of thought, their link to the soul, their purpose, which is a moral purpose, to encourage people to think truly and think clearly and to speak truly, and never to adopt a mere party line on any side of any debate, but always be prepared to rethink, as I have had to do on the global warming question, when the evidence changes. There's a wonderful remark by T.E. Huxley, I think, who said, no, it wasn't him, it was John Maynard Keynes, who said, when the facts change, I change my opinions. What do you do, sir? If you follow the party line, you continue with the party line regardless of the facts.
Now, you do quote quite a bit from philosophers, particularly Aristotle.
Yes.
Who would be your greatest philosopher of all time, your greatest influence?
I think there are a number of possibilities there. The remarkable thing about Aristotle is that in just 2 books, the Prior and Posterior Analytics, he brought forth the entire science of logic, more or less complete, rather like the goddess Athena springing fully armed from the head of Zeus. Astonishing intellectual feat, the like of which has scarcely ever been seen. And so I think probably the greatest of the philosophers that has influenced me is Aristotle, but of course who influenced him? It was Plato at whose feet he sat. And Plato in turn had recorded the dialogues of Socrates arguing against the sophists, the environmentalists or Marxists of his day, who talked the same kind of sophisticated nonsense that these people talk. And Socrates was using a particular technique so that they themselves could see they'd got it wrong. It makes people very angry if you do it to them. They get furious when you show them their thoughts are self-contradictory. And that's very easy if somebody's merely following a party line. But Socrates influenced Plato, Plato influenced Aristotle, and Aristotle brought forth this science of logic more or less complete. And in another book, The Sophistical Refutations, he codified the dozen most common fallacies in human logic, to which I often refer, because those who wish to peddle a party line, and it doesn't matter much on which side of the political divide, will tend to find themselves falling into at least one of these fallacies, not the least of which is the argumentum ad populum, as the medieval schoolmen would later call it, the head count fallacy, the idea that you can decide on the truth of a given proposition by putting it to a vote. No, you can't. The only thing you can put to a vote is what is the people's will. And that doesn't tell you the truth of any proposition at all.
Are you familiar with John McMurray, the philosopher, Scottish philosopher?
I've not read him, but I know who you talk of, yes.
Oh, I just wondered what your thoughts may have been on him or any other modern-day philosopher.
Well, certainly if you look at, for instance, Bertrand Russell, I find him rather tiresome. I mean, you take an example. He spent 150 pages trying to prove that A equals A. Now, the problem with that kind of thing is that A equals A is self-evidently true. It is an axiom. It is a postulate of mathematics. And to try to go back and say, well, we must try and prove that A equals A, that's the kind of vexatious diversion from the sort of more common sense approach to things that I find tiresome in quite a lot of modern philosophy. I like John Stuart Mill very much, though, because he began to see the dangers in the state getting too big, which is, of course, rapidly done since his time. And one of the quotations from him that I like is that a state which dwarfs his men so that they become mere docile instruments in its hands will find that with small men no great thing can be accomplished.
Any thoughts on Ayn Rand and her philosophy of objectivism?
I've not read that either, though I'm broadly familiar with it, so I can't comment intelligently on it. But it's nice that she has managed to achieve a penetration, particularly among young people, and particularly on this side of the Atlantic, which no philosopher of the right has succeeded in doing, certainly in the UK or Europe, in recent decades.
Now, the Conservative Party in Europe is certainly not the Conservative Party that you served with under Margaret Thatcher.
No.
And you've gone and you've joined UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party.
Yes.
Do you see them as your new alternative for a small c conservatism in England?
Well, the sad truth is that the Conservative Party is no longer in a recognisable sense conservative in the way that, say, Margaret Thatcher would have understood it. It has very radically changed. It's now become just another version of socialism.